The sky was heavy with grey clouds, pregnant with the promise of rain. The sharp scent of wet earth clung to the air, and a quiet, ominous calm had settled over the house. A mother, eyes weary from the weight of daily struggle, had left the house just moments ago, the door clicking shut behind her with a finality that echoed through the empty room. In the corner of the room, her daughter, no more than 3 years old, was nestled on the floor, playing with her stuffed bear, unaware of the storm that was about to stir. Their dog, a loyal German shepherd, sat by the door, eyes alert and watchful. It had always been this way, steady, silent, a constant companion to her child. The mother had trusted him. After all, he was family. But trust, like the shifting winds, can betray you. When the mother returned, there was no sign of her little girl. No sounds of laughter, no clatter of tiny feet. The house was eerily quiet, and a knot began to twist in her stomach. The dog was there, but something was different. His eyes, once calm and comforting, were wild with something unrecognizable. Panic struck her heart like a drumbeat. She hurried through the house, calling her daughter's name. No answer. And then, in the corner of the room, she found her. The girl was slumped against the wall, eyes wide open in terror, her tiny hands covered in blood. The mother's breath caught in her chest, her world spinning. The dog stood there, its once gentle face now a mask of confusion, trembling on the edge of something darker. This was not the homecoming she had imagined. This was a nightmare. Show your love, hit like, share, and subscribe for more. The morning sunlight filtered through the dusty blinds, casting soft, golden stripes across the kitchen floor. It was a small house, simple and lived in, but it was theirs. The walls, adorned with a mix of family photos and hand-painted decorations, reflected the warmth of the lives lived here. The kitchen, where the mother spent most of her days, was no different. It smelled faintly of coffee and vanilla, the kind of smell that made a house feel like a home. The hum of the old refrigerator was the only sound that dared break the stillness as the mother moved about her small kingdom. She stood by the counter, stirring the pot of soup that had been simmering for hours, her eyes scanning the list of chores she still needed to finish. Laundry, dishes, grocery shopping. There was always something to do. Always something that needed attention. But today, the house felt heavier than usual. Maybe it was the change in the weather. A storm had been brewing for days, dark clouds hovering ominously in the distance, threatening to pour down their fury. But for now, it was still. The calm before the storm. She looked over at her daughter, who was sitting on the floor of the living room, her back to the mother. The little girl, no more than 3, was lost in her world of imagination. She had a stuffed bear clutched tightly to her chest, whispering to it in a soft, unintelligible voice. Her small hands moved in precise, careful motions as she adjusted the bear's clothes, treating it as if it were real, as if it had a life of its own. The mother couldn't help but smile. There was something pure about these moments, the simple, unspoken connection between mother and child. The way the world could feel so right when they were together in these quiet spaces, removed from the demands of the outside world. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt truly at peace, but right now, watching her daughter, it felt like a fleeting moment of grace. The dog lay beside her, just as much a part of the family as any human member. He was a large German shepherd, his coat a mixture of golden and brown, and his eyes were sharp, always watchful. He didn't need to be told to protect. It was in his nature. He had been with them since the daughter was born, and the bond between them had grown deep over the years. There had never been a hint of aggression from him, always loyalty, always calm. He was part of the rhythm of the house, always by the door when they returned home, always following the mother from room to room, as if keeping her safe from invisible dangers. The mother glanced over at the dog, her eyes meeting his steady gaze. His eyes were calm, but there was something else there, something she couldn't place. Perhaps it was the unease of the storm. Maybe it was just her own tiredness creeping in, pulling at the corners of her mind. She shook it off, turning back to the soup on the stove. Her daughter's giggle broke through the quiet, light and carefree. The little girl's voice, small but filled with joy, filled the room as she continued to chat with her bear. "Don't be silly, bear." The girl giggled, You have to put your shoes on first. Then we can go outside." The mother's lips twitched in a smile, but her thoughts were already drifting back to the endless tasks awaiting her. She had a meeting later in the day, and the house still needed cleaning. It was never ending. The weight of it all, the constant juggling, the quiet exhaustion that threatened to overtake her, was something she had learned to live with. But she wasn't complaining. It was her life. The life she had chosen. And when she looked at her daughter, at the joy that radiated from her, it felt like everything was worth it. All of the sacrifices, all of the early mornings, late nights, and moments spent wishing for a break. It all melted away in the presence of that innocent laughter. The doorbell rang, and the mother's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. Who could that be? She muttered to herself, wiping her hands on the dish towel before moving toward the door. She opened it cautiously, her gaze scanning the porch. No one. Just a delivery on the doorstep. She knelt down to pick it up, glancing at the label. It was a package for her, something she had ordered weeks ago but had forgotten about. Her fingers ran over the cardboard, a slight frown crossing her face as she wondered if this was the new blender she had bought, or maybe the shoes she had been meaning to return. She carried the box inside, setting it down on the kitchen table. As she turned around, the dog stood up from his resting spot, his ears alert. He didn't bark. He never barked. But his gaze was fixed, intense. His posture had changed from relaxed to alert in the span of a heartbeat. "What's wrong?" "Boy." The mother looked at him, confused by his sudden shift in demeanor. But before she could make sense of it, her daughter's voice called out to her from the living room. "Mummy, look! My bear can dance!" The child's laughter rang out like music sweet and innocent. The mother's heart swelled with love, and for a moment, all the worries of the world seemed to slip away. She stepped back into the living room, her gaze softening as she watched her daughter perform an elaborate dance with the bear, spinning it in the air and twirling around in the living room. The dog remained by the door, watching them both, his body stiff and unmoving. "Be careful, sweetie," the mother warned gently, stepping forward to guide the little girl away from the edge of the coffee table. "Look, Mommy! It's spinning!" the girl said with glee, her face glowing with excitement. For a moment, the world outside seemed far away, irrelevant. It was just the three of them, mother, daughter, and dog, lost in this little bubble of perfect simplicity. But the storm was still coming. The world outside was shifting, and everything, the peace, the calm, was about to change. And neither the mother nor the dog knew that yet. The door had just clicked shut behind her, and the mother's steps echoed through the empty street. It was a small errand, one of those quick, mundane tasks that could easily be ticked off the list, a rare moment of solitude she almost felt guilty for craving. She didn't allow herself much time for breaks, but today, the weight of everything seemed heavier. The streets outside were empty, the sky darkening quickly as the storm finally began to roll in, the first drops of rain spattering against the pavement like soft whispers. She hurried down the steps, her coat tugged tight around her shoulders. The wind was picking up, pushing through the trees and sending a chill through the air. She glanced back at the house, feeling a fleeting pang of unease that she couldn't explain. The dog had been acting strange earlier, his quiet demeanor something the mother hadn't expected. Perhaps it was the weather, or maybe it was just the wariness that had clouded her mind. She didn't know. But she trusted the dog. She always had. A small part of her wished she could shake off the feeling that lingered at the back of her thoughts, like a dark shadow just beyond reach. But she told herself it was nothing. The day had been calm. Too calm, perhaps. She dismissed it, taking a deep breath as she reached the bottom of the driveway. The errand was quick. There was something oddly soothing about the routine of it all, the sense of accomplishment when tasks were completed, even small ones. She'd pick up the package from the post office, grab some milk, and return home. But as she stepped back into the house, the familiar scent of home didn't greet her as it usually did. Instead, it felt distant off. The first thing that hit her was the silence. There was no sound of her daughter's laughter. No clatter of toys being thrown on the floor, or the soft hum of a cartoon playing on the television. The house was unnervingly still, "Sweetie." The mother's voice trembled slightly as she called out, her heart starting to race. She could hear the soft padding of the dog's paws as he moved towards her, but that was it. The house had fallen into a strange, suffocating quiet. Her feet moved instinctively toward the living room. She had only been gone for a few minutes, yet everything felt wrong. The air was thick with something she couldn't name, something almost oppressive. Her eyes scanned the room quickly, but the sight that met her gaze made her blood run cold. Her daughter was sitting in the corner, her small figure slumped against the wall, her legs splayed out in an unnatural position. For a moment the mother's heart stopped beating. "Is everything okay, sweetie?" She forced herself to speak, her voice trembling as her feet carried her closer. But there was no response. The dog was standing next to her daughter, his body stiff and tense. His eyes, usually so steady, were wide, almost wild, and his breathing was shallow. He looked up at the mother with a strange urgency, his body trembling as if he had been holding himself back from something. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest, something almost primal. The mother's stomach twisted as she rushed forward, her mind racing. She knelt beside her daughter, her hands shaking as she reached for her small, cold body. "Sweetheart, are you okay? Talk to me, baby. Mommy's here." Her daughter's eyes flicked up to meet hers, wide and filled with something she couldn't quite comprehend. There was no recognition, no warmth in those eyes, only fear, and something else, something darker. Her breath hitched as she glanced down, her hand moving instinctively to her daughter's arms, where blood stained her clothes, her tiny hands red and sticky. The blood wasn't hers. The blood was something else. What happened? The question tore from her throat, her voice cracking as she pulled the girl closer, trying to make sense of the horrific scene. The world spun around her as her gaze snapped back to the dog. His eyes were wild now, his body trembling as if battling an inner conflict. His loyalty to her, to the family, was evident, but something had changed. Something had snapped. A wave of confusion and terror flooded over her, the room spinning around her as she stood frozen, unable to process the scene. The dog growled again, louder this time, the sound raw and guttural. It wasn't the low warning growl she had grown used to. It was a sign of something else, something she couldn't control. And in that moment, she realized with chilling clarity that the trust she had placed in him, trust that had been built over years of shared memories and companionship, had been shattered in the blink of an eye. The dog, the protector of her family, had turned into something else entirely. She wanted to scream, to shout for help, but her voice wouldn't come. She could only stare at her daughter, her small body trembling in her arms, her wide eyes filled with confusion. The mother couldn't understand it. The pieces didn't fit. She couldn't reconcile the dog she knew, the one who had been a constant in their lives, with the one standing before her now, growling in a way that felt alien, primal. Her thoughts swirled like a storm inside her mind. What had happened? What had gone wrong? Her heart pounded in her chest, the fear rising like bile in her throat. "Mommy, I'm scared," her daughter whispered, her tiny voice barely a breath. The mother's heart shattered at the sound of her daughter's fear. She didn't know what to say, how to reassure her. How could she, when she didn't even understand what had happened? How could she protect her when the very creature she had trusted with her child had turned on them? Her mind raced. She had to do something. But her body felt heavy, frozen with a mix of terror and disbelief. There was no way to undo what had been done. There was no way to rewind time and keep her daughter from this horror. The dog's growls faded as he stepped back, his body slowly lowering, his posture shifting from aggressive to something more uncertain. The tension was still thick in the air, but now there was only silence. The mother's breathing slowed, though her heart still beat with a violent intensity. She held her daughter close, pressing her forehead to the child's trembling brow. The tears were inevitable now, spilling down her face as she tried to calm herself, to make sense of what had just happened. But the more she tried to understand, the more impossible it seemed. The trust had been broken. In that moment, she realized the bond she had relied on had been shattered, irrevocably, and the storm outside, once so distant, was now right on top of them. mirroring the turmoil brewing inside the mother's chest. There was no calm after the storm, only the wreckage it left behind. The hours that followed were a blur, a chaotic whirlwind of questions without answers, of fear without comfort. The mother's mind was a whirlwind, caught in a storm of disbelief and dread. She couldn't process it, couldn't make sense of what had happened. She clung to her daughter, whispering reassurances that didn't feel like enough, the words barely able to rise above the storm raging inside her. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed suffocating. The air was thick with tension, the walls closing in around her. She hadn't expected this. Not like this. Not from the dog, the one who had been with them since the beginning. He had always been there, by her side, by her daughter's side, a protector, a companion. He was supposed to be their safe haven. And yet now, he was the source of all her fears, a stark reminder of the fragility of trust. She couldn't understand what had happened to him. The dog had always been calm, his eyes warm and reassuring, always watching over them. But now he stood by the door, his head lowered, his eyes filled with something that could only be described as fear, confusion, and perhaps even shame. His once unshakable loyalty seemed fractured, like a glass vase shattered by the smallest of touches. The room felt too small, the walls closing in as she walked in a daze, her hand still on her daughter's arm, clutching her like a lifeline. She couldn't bring herself to look at the bloodstains on her daughter's hands, couldn't allow herself to focus on the source of the terror she had seen in the child's eyes. Why? The words slipped from her mouth, barely a whisper. She hadn't even realized she had spoken it aloud. It felt like a question she would never be able to answer. Why had this happened? What had triggered it? What had gone wrong? She could still hear the dog's growls echoing in her ears. The sound that had filled the house with an ominous weight, a low rumble that had been so out of place. She remembered how his body had trembled, how his posture had shifted from calm to something darker, something primal. There had been no warning, no signs. It had come without explanation, and now she was left with the aftermath. Her daughter clung to her face buried in her mother's chest, her body still shaking with fear. The mother's heart broke at the sight of her. So small, so innocent, and yet already touched by something she could never unsee. She stroked her daughter's hair, her own breath shaky, her hands trembling. She didn't know how to fix this. She didn't know how to make it go away. The dog had not moved since the moment she had found her daughter, standing in the corner, his body rigid with a mix of fear and guilt. She glanced at him now, her gaze meeting his. His eyes were wide, pleading almost. It was as if he, too, was lost in the confusion, unsure of what had driven him to do what he did. There had been no warning signs, no aggressive tendencies, no indications that anything was wrong. And yet the chaos that had unfolded was undeniable. The room felt suffocating. The walls seemed to press in on her, the silence deafening, broken only by the soft sound of her daughter's sobs and the occasional shuffle of the dog's paws. It was the stillness that made everything feel worse, like the calm before the storm had been replaced by an even greater chaos. The mother paced, her mind 1,000 miles away. She needed answers. She needed to understand. Her thoughts swirled in a chaotic spiral, memories of the dog's behavior flashing before her eyes. Had she missed something? Had she overlooked a sign? She couldn't recall a single moment that would have tipped her off to what was coming. The dog had been there, loyal and true, watching over her family, and yet now, he was the one she feared. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to make sense of this madness. But the only thing she could do was sit down, pull her daughter into her lap, and hold her as tightly as possible. The child's sobs had subsided into quiet hiccups, but her body still trembled in the mother's arms, her little fingers clutching at the mother's clothing as if she were afraid to let go. The mother couldn't blame her. How could she? She, too, was terrified. Terrified of the dog, terrified of what had happened, and most of all, terrified of what might come next. "I don't know what happened," the mother whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She was speaking to the dog now, though she wasn't sure why. She wasn't expecting him to answer. But somehow, it felt necessary. "I don't know what went wrong." The dog didn't move. He stayed in his place by the door, his body rigid, his gaze fixed on her. His eyes told a story of confusion, of fear, of regret. But it was too late for apologies. Too late for anything. He had crossed a line, and the mother wasn't sure if she could ever feel the same way about him again. Her mind raced with thoughts of calling for help. She knew she should, knew she needed to. But who could help her now? Who could fix this? What could they even say to explain what had happened here, in this once safe home? She had trusted this dog with her daughter, with her life, and now she wasn't sure who he was anymore. She wasn't sure who she was anymore. The doorbell rang again, snapping her from her thoughts. It was jarring, like the sound of an alarm in the middle of a nightmare. She didn't want to answer it. She didn't want to see anyone, to explain what had happened, to face the world outside her home. She wanted to shut herself away, to hide from the questions that she didn't know how to answer. The dog growled low again, a sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She glanced at him, her heart hammering in her chest. "Stay," she muttered, though she wasn't sure if the word was meant for the dog or herself. She had to answer the door, had to face the reality of what was happening. She had no other choice. She stood, her legs shaky, and slowly moved toward the door, still holding her daughter close. As she opened the door, she found herself staring into the eyes of a neighbor, someone who had heard the commotion, heard the dog's growls and the silence that had followed. They were here to check on her, to make sure everything was all right. But nothing was all right. Everything was wrong. The air inside the house was thick with uncertainty, every moment stretching out like an eternity. The tension that had plagued the mother since the discovery of her daughter's blood-stained hands was no longer just a passing shadow. It had taken root deep inside her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had hoped, even if just for a moment, that the shock would pass, that she would wake up from this nightmare. But there was no waking up. Not from this. The dog, her once beloved companion, now stood at the edges of her world, his loyalty fractured, his behavior incomprehensible. The house, once a sanctuary, felt more like a cage. Her mind spun, the questions relentless. Why did he do it? What had triggered this? Could I have seen it coming? The answers weren't coming. She felt the weight of the unknown press down on her, suffocating her in a way nothing else had. The dog, her protector, was the cause of all this pain. She couldn't wrap her mind around it. Her thoughts were jagged, slipping between moments of guilt, fear, and desperation. "I need to know," she whispered to herself, as if the act of saying it out loud would somehow summon the answers. She needed to understand why this had happened, what had changed. The dog, sensing her turmoil, had moved to the far corner of the room, his body rigid, his eyes never leaving her. But he had retreated. He no longer seemed like the same creature. Was it fear? Was it guilt? Or something darker, something primal that had been lurking beneath the surface all along? She turned to her daughter, who was curled up in the corner, her small form trembling despite the comfort of her mother's embrace. The mother's heart broke again. "I should have protected you from this," she thought, a guilt gnawing at her insides. But how could she have protected her from the dog? How could she have known this would happen? For the first time since it had all begun, the mother felt the overwhelming weight of her isolation. The dog was still there, and while she couldn't find it within herself to trust him, she didn't know what to do with him either. What was he now? The creature she had trusted with her child's life had been turned into an enigma, something to fear, something foreign. She was frozen, trapped in the silent chaos that had descended upon her once quiet home. And then the doorbell rang again. She had heard it earlier, but this time the sound seemed to pierce through the fog in her mind, snapping her back to the present. She glanced over at the dog, who was still standing by the corner, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The mother hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to answer. It was a small, irrational fear, but it lingered. She had not been prepared for what was on the other side of that door. Still, she couldn't keep hiding. With slow, deliberate steps, she moved to the door and opened it, her breath catching as she faced the people standing outside. A pair of animal control officers stood in the doorway. The woman was tall, her posture professional yet cautious, as if she had seen this kind of thing before. The man beside her was older, his face lined with years of experience, though his eyes held something softer, sympathy, perhaps, or pity. The mother barely had time to speak before the woman addressed her in a calm, authoritative voice. "We've received a call about a situation here," the officer said, her eyes scanning the room over the mother's shoulder. "We were told there's been an incident involving your dog." The words felt like a slap to the face. Your dog. It took everything in the mother to remain standing. Her heart was in her throat, her thoughts scattered, but she managed to force a tight smile, though it felt brittle and unnatural. "Yes," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "There was an incident. My daughter, she's fine now. She's okay." But her voice faltered. She didn't know what to say. How could she explain this? How could she tell them that the dog, the one who had always been a protector, had become something else in a moment of madness? How could she explain to these strangers, to the world, that everything she had known had just shattered? The officers stepped inside without waiting for further invitation, and the mother stepped aside, suddenly feeling like a stranger in her own home. She could feel the dog's gaze on her back as they passed by him, and she fought to keep her voice steady as she spoke. He's never acted this way before," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush, as if by speaking them she could make the situation more real, more tangible. "He's always been kind, gentle. I don't know what happened." The officers exchanged a glance, and the woman nodded gently. "We'll need to take him in for an evaluation," she said. "It's standard procedure when there's an attack like this." "Attack?" The mother's voice broke at the word. It felt foreign, brutal. He didn't attack anyone. It wasn't like that. I don't know what happened." She felt desperate now, her hands wringing together as she tried to explain the inexplicable. "Please, just don't take him. I need answers first. I need to know why. Why did he do this?" The older officer's face softened slightly. "I understand this is hard, ma'am," he said gently, his voice steady. "But we can't take any chances. This is part of the process. We'll get to the bottom of it." The words, though comforting in their own way, made the mother feel more helpless than ever. She had thought she could figure this out herself. She had hoped she could manage it, that the answers would come to her in time. But now, with the officers standing there, ready to take her dog away, she realized how little control she had. The story was no longer hers to tell. It was theirs to unravel. As they led the dog out, the mother couldn't help but feel as if something within her was being taken as well. She had trusted the dog. She had trusted him with her daughter, with her heart, and now he was being taken from her. She watched as the officers led him out the door, the dog's steps heavy and reluctant, his head low as if he knew what was coming. She didn't want to let him go, not like this. She didn't want to face the reality that the creature she had once considered part of her family had turned into a dangerous unknown. But as the door closed behind him, she realized with a deep, aching clarity that this was no longer about her or the dog. It was about survival. Her daughter was still trembling in the corner of the room, her small form lost in the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded. The mother moved toward her, her arms reaching out instinctively. She needed to comfort her, to make her feel safe again. But the comfort she sought, the answers she needed, weren't in her hands anymore. The dog was gone. The world she had built was shattered, and she didn't know how to put it back together again. The house had never felt so empty. Even the stillness in the air seemed to whisper, echoing the silence left in the wake of the dog's departure. It wasn't just the absence of his large, familiar form by the door, nor the soft thud of his paws on the wooden floor that now seemed so distant. It was the absence of trust, of something so foundational in the mother's life, something she had never questioned. Her protector, her companion, had turned on them, and now there was no way to reconcile that with the love she had once felt for him. Her daughter, curled up in the corner of the room, had stopped crying. The initial shock had left her voice hoarse, but her eyes, those wide, fearful eyes, still seemed to carry the weight of a pain that wasn't hers to bear. The mother sat beside her, pulling her close once more. She didn't know what to say, how to make it right. How could she? There was no magic word, no gentle whisper that could heal the wound left by this betrayal. The mother, too, was struggling to understand. The questions still burned inside her. Why had he done it? What had changed? But with each passing moment, the urgency of those questions began to fade, replaced by something deeper, something more painful, the need for healing, for growth. It was late, the storm still raging outside, but inside the mother's heart, the tempest had begun to quiet. As she held her daughter, stroking her hair, she realized that this moment, was just another chapter in their story. It was messy and broken, but it was their story, and in every broken part, there was still love. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered, her voice breaking as she kissed the top of her daughter's head. "I'm sorry this happened, but I promise, we're going to be okay." The little girl nodded against her chest, though the fear in her eyes hadn't entirely gone. The mother didn't know how long it would take to undo the damage, to rebuild the trust and security they had once had. But she knew one thing: they would rebuild, one step at a time. She thought about the dog, his sad eyes as they led him away, his silent departure from the house they had shared. The woman had told her that the evaluation would take time, that they would figure out what had triggered the aggression. Maybe it was something deep inside him, some hidden trauma or instinct that had erupted without warning. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was something else entirely, something beyond her understanding. But in the end, it didn't matter. She couldn't control what had happened to him, just like she couldn't control the world around them. But she could control what happened next. With a deep breath, she lifted her daughter into her arms, holding her as tightly as she dared without crushing her. Outside, the rain began to lighten, the storm subsiding in quiet surrender. The world was still heavy with everything they had endured. But in this moment, there was room for something else: hope. And though the road ahead was uncertain, with healing coming slow and uneven, the mother knew that the love they shared, the strength that still pulsed between them, would carry them through. Together, they would face whatever came next. Together, they would find their way back to the peace they once knew, even if it had to be built, piece by piece.